The name of this channel is The Complex Games Apologist. That's me. I originally got into this YouTube scene because I thought that the thick and chunky role-playing games of yesteryear, the sort that had procedures and subsystems for the little bits and bobs, the things that would happen in gameplay that would immerse game masters and players within the worlds that we all saw in our third eye of imagination, put you in the perspective of the characters and NPCs rather than just telling a story, was an idea that needed an advocate. There was a heck of a lot of dunking on complex systems in RPGs going on at the time.
Get a load of this guy.
I've created a body of rhetoric here, speaking to how my play preferences are served by some of that stuff. One thing that I haven't spoken to a great deal is how to learn these larger RPGs, what it's like to be in the process of learning them, to be embarked on that journey where you're trying to learn to do it, but you haven't yet arrived. And today I stumbled across a quote, a little maxim, in an article by a YouTuber who's on a parallel course to mine. Our channels have similar outlooks, but different subject matters. That's Ardwulf's Lair. There's an article that I read of his, and he was giving some advice about how to learn very large tabletop war games, Hex and Counter style gameplay. And the penultimate maxim that he offered was, don't waffle, just play. Instead of reading the rule book, get down there in the dirt and put the counters on the map. Maybe you'll be playing with yourself. Maybe you'll be seeing different little subsystems play out. How far can these pieces move? What does a combat look like? What are the downstream consequences of a single encounter or phase of gameplay? That was really striking to me because that's been my philosophy, more or less, to learning thick and chunky role-playing games over the years, is to get down into it. Be willing to make mistakes, both once I have players at the table and with myself, as far as imagining campaigns and scenarios. Sometimes I'll have an idea. I will pitch a campaign and I'll be off the mark of what the book, the tone of the book is suggesting, of what the mechanics are suggesting, and it'll fall flat to an audience, or I'll be challenged as I discover that my expectations are out of sync with the reality. Here's an example of that. Very early on, after the release of Star Trek Adventures, I started pitching this idea for the game called The Two Federations, and I kept showing the ship as a Saladin-class destroyer in the TOS era. It was going to be about the contact between an alliance of Trill, Beta Z, and Benzar, and how they came into contact with the Federation of Vulcan, Earth, and humanity. And those early years of interface where long caravans of starships were building up the diplomacy and knitting the cultures of these two interstellar peaceful alliances into one united federation of planets. I thought this was a really compelling, Wild Westy style topic. I didn't get a whole lot of responses, though. I did the whole interest post thing where there was a pitch for a campaign that I thought was very rich and scintillating with ripe adventures. And people didn't like it. One reason that I discovered is that I read the book a little bit more, and I started to understand that the book has the players creating the ship. After you make your player characters in Star Trek Adventures, after the player characters come together and knit as a team, and you select your different bridge crew roles, which is a phase unto itself in the rule book, then the players work together to select what class of ship and the sort of mission profile that the ship has, and the talents for the ship. That is creating a shared character among the players. It's a point of attachment and love that Star Trek Adventures has in mind for the players to grow into. It's a place where you start to get some investment and buy-in from your players. And I was denying or sidestepping that moment that was in the rule book. Now, I'm not saying that you as a game master can't pitch games based on that premise. And in fact, I think I still will when it comes to one-shots or kind of tabletop motion picture or 80s miniseries style games. But when it comes to pitching something in the mold of a television series in the Star Trek lineage, I think I was off the mark there. I only learned by trying that out, by experimenting, by putting the little pieces on the board. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit more about some positive ways to start playing and stop waffling when you want to learn, and what I think are some blind alleys, some turns that you can go down which will keep up your enthusiasm for a particular RPG system, but may not make you any more prepared for what's going to happen. One of them is plotting. As a game master, what I mean by that is sketching out the entirety of a course of a campaign and thinking about how, well, first we're going to learn about the big bad evil guy in episode 1, and we're going to have an encounter with some of his minions, and we're going to have a B plot, which involves an escaped stowaway aboard the ship and some romance and star-crossed lovers. And you start doing that, and then you move on to the next episode, and you start thinking of things to fill that up with. But the one thing that you may not have done before you started pouring your efforts into that is looking at what combat looks like on the table. How does it really feel to roll the dice, and what can players accomplish? One thing that I thought would happen a great deal when I started running Star Trek Adventures was that the player characters would really master the pacing tools. They would be able to use their determination informed by values to make it so, to generate piles of momentum, conclude scenes because there was nothing more to do here, and the plot would advance. I had the impression that players might be ready to start combat-like encounters, as in pull out their phasers and hold hostile people at gunpoint. Not so fast, buddy. Or possibly, no, back off, don't shoot, we're beaming up. You can run away in Star Trek, of course. It's quite an honorable course of action in that universe. And I was under the impression that since the mechanics gave the player characters the first move by default, that we'd see more of that. But I hadn't accounted for how there's a learning curve, that these are things which take time to master, for them to be observed in play and then used as a first resort or default from the player stance. And then you also have to bring in that culture of play aspect, that consensus among the players that it does work that way. And, you know, when you see a fully mature adult red dragon in Dungeons and Dragons and your third level player characters, most people are understanding that this means duck and cover. This means plead for your lives rather than draw your swords and charge headlong like the light brigade into the canister shot to die nobly. That's 40 years of accumulated experience around Dungeons and Dragons like games that have very similar gameplay aspects where you roll one time to attack and one time to damage, and you inflict hit points, which usually aren't all of the opponent's hit points, and vice versa. The mechanics are often very unfamiliar when you're picking up a new RPG. What does the injury track look like? How many hits does that injury track really mean? What sort of options can you pick on a character to be confident that you can take an extra hit or two? In D&D, we all know that you can make a barbarian with a high constitution, and that means you can take at least one extra hit. If I challenged myself to answer that same question about Fantasy Flight Star Wars, for example, or Shadowrun, I would need to look in the book and really think about it. And that's another way that you can start playing with yourself when it comes to learning these RPGs.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
Instead of premeditating the idea that you created a tough guy, you can test that out by comparing weapon damage to your tough guy's envisioned hit points. Before you set out to create a tough guy, even, and write a long backstory, you might even examine what it means to be tough in the universe that this RPG's gameplay is implying. Does this mean that your guy is able to intimidate and stay out of combat, to end fights before they start because he's a quick draw, because he looks tough? Or does it mean that he gets knocked down and he gets back up again? The gameplay, the rules, will have some answers embedded in them. Now, I'm not saying don't play the game and discover that. In fact, that can be an incredibly rich experience to discover the nuance that the game system is injecting into your role-playing. Sitting around the table and learning how the rules sculpt and meander what everyone thought they had in mind, and as it becomes something shared and unique, is a incredibly valuable experience. And one of the reasons that I'm still so interested in this hobby. Don't waffle, just play. Sometimes this means taking the dice, sitting yourself down, studying one part of the rule book in consultation with another, hit points in consultation with spell damage, for example. Or it could mean actually finding some folks and playing a game even when you're not terribly confident of the rules. Hackmaster is a first edition AD&D OSR homage that I am incredibly fond of. I love it. It has so many interesting modulations to the old AD&D mold. It's an otherworldly construct that is sort of an imagining of what it would be like if Gary Gygax and that lineage of wargamers had stepped into the world of 1985 and even 1990 as far as what was happening with role-playing games, mechanically applied their minds to some of the trends. And there's an honor mechanic, which, based on your alignment in Hackmaster, you can gain honor for certain actions, and you can lose honor for certain actions, and you can spend your honor to gain honor dice. You can purge it to effectively rewind time just a moment to avoid death, to cheat death, to plead with the gods for another chance, in other words. And there was a lot of mistakes made on my part as the game master with how that mechanic actually worked.
I have made some mistakes.
I didn't understand how temporal honor was a floating value that you gained in the session. At the end of the session, you took a quarter of that and applied it to your base honor score. I totally missed that the first time around. I didn't understand how to effectively tease the player characters with loss of honor in gameplay. The player characters, of course, took their time learning how to spend that currency. In the same way that I spoke to how it takes time to learn how to spend and regain your determination in Star Trek Adventures. You know what? That was an incredible campaign of Hackmaster. That first one, where we played half of the rulebook wrong. We played it a little bit not as intended, and there were a number of things that went totally over our heads because none of us was familiar with first edition AD&D and what was being parodized and what was serious. Don't waffle. Just play. If you are intrigued by a role-playing game,
Just do it!
get it out. Crack open the book, pick up some dice, get some paper, and start animating what you see on the page. Take some notes. And one incredibly useful technique is to create some NPCs. What does a gumshoe, low-level detective who's not yet made sergeant look like? in a noir role-playing game? What does the faithful assistant, the one who keeps the law office or the secretary for the private detective, what does her stat block look like? What do the Nazi thugs and Soviet spies who become an enemy look like? And compare that to what the game is giving as a starting player character. A world of gameplay, a world of not waffling and getting underwater in it, which will develop your affection for the game, make you more ready to play it, and possibly give you more interesting ideas about how to pitch a new game, how to create a character which you can wave around to your fellow role players if you want to be a player, and show, look what kind of character I want to play, and would you create a character that will stand alongside mine and go boldly? Ardwulf's Lair is an excellent channel for Hex and Counter Role-Playing Game, and the idea for this video comes entirely from his own writing. I'd suggest that you head over there and give him a few views. He's a great guy. Happy gaming, and have a glorious autumn. The apples are coming into season.